Hello, I'm the Game Professor, and welcome to Games as Lit 101. We've missed an October or two, but it's finally time to talk about the third entry in my favorite horror series. Today, we're digging into Fatal Frame 3, The Tormented. I've gone on before about how much I love the original Fatal Frame trilogy. They're easily my favorite horror games, and I find them brilliant in ways that few games even today have ever managed to capture. But over time, through a few lackluster sequels with weird Western localization issues and a near-complete lack of efforts to preserve the originals in playable forms for modern audiences, the games have lost much of the cultural awareness and appreciation they used to enjoy. And strangely, the third game in the series, The Tormented, is the most affected by these difficulties. As usual, I'd highly recommend playing this game before watching this video, but unlike the previous two games in the series, it didn't get an Xbox port a year after release, and unlike Crimson Butterfly, it didn't get a re-release on the Wii years down the road. The only ways to play this game legally are to shell out like $100 to some rando on eBay, or buy it digitally on the PlayStation 3, and only the PlayStation 3, for however long Sony continues to even let us do that. In other words, there are no easily accessible ways to purchase this game that contribute to its creators at all, so, you know.
Piracy itself can be the right course.
Point being, Fatal Frame 3 is the least played, least remembered, and least beloved of this classic horror trilogy. It's also my favorite. So, here, have a long YouTube video where I explain why that is. You're welcome. In all seriousness though, while Fatal Frame 2 was an inspired improvement on the already solid base of the first game, Fatal Frame 3 is a bold, experimental attempt to build on the foundations of the series in interesting, terrifying, and powerful ways, resulting in a game that's a little rougher around the edges than its predecessor, but carries much more weight and significance, putting a fitting capstone on this masterful trilogy of games. Well, at least until the eventual 4th, 5th, and weird 3DS spin-off games, but we'll cross those bridges when we come to them. So, let's talk about my personal favorite horror game in my personal favorite horror series. What it means, how it means it, and whether or not it means it well. Spoilers follow, of course, for this game as well as the previous two. Also, this story deals with pretty heavy subject matter, torture, grief, death, and kinda sorta touches on suicidal ideation, so fair warning. So, first up, let's unpack just what happens in this game so we can get to picking it apart and getting at its heart. Rei Kurosawa was driving on a rainy night when she lost control, and the resulting car crash killed her fiancé, Yu. Through the grief and guilt, Rei poured herself into her work as a photographer, even branching into Yu's line of work as a folklorist, with the help of none other than Miku Hinasaki, the protagonist of the original Fatal Frame. Yu had taken her in following the disappearance of her brother in the first game, and she stuck around to help Rei in the aftermath of the accident. The game paints a rather vivid picture of their life together, and how crucial Miku has become for helping keep Rei together. In Rei's apartment, which the player gets to explore on a number of occasions throughout the game, Rei notes how much of the work around the house is handled by Miku, even going so far as to state that it feels more like Miku's apartment than hers. It's clear that Rei struggles to take care of herself in her grief, and Miku's supportive presence is largely responsible for whatever stability Rei currently enjoys. Right off the bat, the game is giving us a much more detailed picture of its protagonist than the previous two. The first game only really established Miku as Mafuyu's brother, and a bit about his past and occupation for the purpose of understanding his connection to the folklorist Takamine. And Crimson Butterfly really only gave us the bits of Mio and Mayu's backstory that pertained to the tension and fears that were central to the game's events. But The Tormented is clearly telling a far more personal story from the word go. While taking photos of an abandoned manor, Rei sees her dead fiancé walking away from her and further into the manor. When she follows him, she ends up in some kind of dreamlike state, following him further and further until she's accosted by a ghostly woman covered in tattoos. She then finds herself being staked to the ground by her hands and feet by young shrine maidens while a blue tattoo slowly spreads over her body, and then she snaps out of it. She assumes she must have imagined it, but when she develops the film from that day, she finds that Yu did actually show up in the photo, after which point, she begins to see the manor in her dreams. And it's here we get to one of the main things that distinguishes this game from the other two. Rather than being trapped in a single physical location that we explore over the course of the game, the haunted house, so to speak, in Fatal Frame 3 is in the protagonist's dreams. By night, the player explores the Manor of Sleep in traditional Fatal Frame style, along with the series' trademark combat against ghosts with the camera obscura. But between excursions, they control Rei as she explores her own house, develops photos from her dreams that appear in the actual camera obscura the next morning, and works with Miku to try and figure out what's going on. Oh, and yes, you can indeed pet the cat. This format has its share of both upsides and downsides, but overall, I think it's absolutely brilliant. It does have the unfortunate effect of making the game feel kind of fractured, structurally speaking. It can be relatively hard to follow the story, and especially the backstory being revealed through objects and diaries, when the process of uncovering it is constantly interrupted with segments that have a completely different tone, setting, and gameplay style. One could also argue it makes it a bit more difficult to develop an intimate familiarity with the manor itself. I personally found myself having to check the map for directions far more often than I had in the previous two games. But these are minor complaints compared to what the game gains from this formula, the first example of which is that it shifts the role of folklore in this story to a far more central place. Folklore has always played a major role in the Fatal Frame games, serving as both a foundation for their settings and a lens through which we come to understand their mystical events. But as far as the stories are concerned, it's largely background. We learn the truth of these stories through the work of folklorists like Takamine and Makabe, and we take up a similar role by using a camera to banish the shadows shrouding that truth in what is still a brilliant metaphorical gameplay device. But in Fatal Frame 3, the protagonists take a more active role in researching these events, sifting through the legends and folktales that surround them, and discovering for themselves what's going on. By giving photos to Miku and letting her do some research, the player can discover stories and legends that relate to the Manor of Sleep. By sifting through Yu's research in his nearly untouched room, Rei can discover increasingly helpful information as she explores the Manor of Sleep and has more of an idea of what to look for. Rei even does some of the fieldwork herself, which we'll get to in a minute. The result is that the game includes more incidental folklore, such as varying versions of the same stories told in different villages of rural Japan, but also that the player is a much more active agent in uncovering the actual folklore behind the game's events. And that's far from the only way the game benefits from the sequences in Rei's house, but we'll be getting to the other stuff when we dig a little deeper. Rei finds a girl in the mansion that she doesn't know, who seems to be tormented by a bunch of shadows and begging to be woken up. A photo developed through the physical camera obscura and a bit of research on Miku's part reveals that this woman is Yoshino Takigawa. She was the sole survivor of a deadly crash that killed her family and her partner, and now lies comatose in a nearby hospital. Rei visits her, and Yoshino seems to wake up for a moment before disappearing, leaving behind only a black mark where she had been. But Yoshino is still in the Manor of Sleep, her soul now trapped there as just another hostile spirit. Rei continues to explore the mansion, slowly uncovering more about what's going on there and following her departed fiancé deeper and deeper inside. But as time goes on, things start getting a bit weirder. Rei wakes up each morning with the tattoo from the dream spreading from her back more and more each day. Miku is also having trouble, sleeping increasingly poorly and complaining of bad dreams and idly singing a lullaby that Rei heard in the manor. And it doesn't help that Rei is getting letters from someone named Kei, a friend of Yu's who doesn't yet know about Yu's death, about his own research into the mansion on behalf of his niece, Mio Amakura, the surviving protagonist of Fatal Frame 2. It seems that the Manor of Sleep haunts the dreams of those who lost loved ones in terrible circumstances, but made it out themselves. Miku lost her brother Mafuyu in the first game, Mio killed her own twin sister in the second, and Rei's fiancé died in a car accident with her at the wheel. What's stranger, Rei seems to share dreams with Miku, who also ends up dreaming of Himuro Mansion. Not the actual full manor from the first game, but some of its most distinctive and important parts slapped together, as though the Manor of Sleep is pulling bits of Miku's trauma into its own architecture. The next night, Rei dreams of Kei, who also seems to be pulled into these dreams. While Rei is chasing Yu and Miku is chasing Mafuyu, Kei finds himself trying to free Mio from a locked cage, the same cage Mio tried to free Mayu from in the previous game. The player takes control of all three characters, of course, and all three have subtle differences in their playstyles and abilities. Also, though, I find it kind of funny that this game manages to simultaneously lean into one kind of tired sexist video game trope while also completely subverting another one. Entirely on accident, it seems. I definitely groaned a little when I ran into a dresser in front of a door and the game was like, I bet only a man would be strong enough to move this. But then, another common trope is men getting the action sequences and women getting the stealthy ones, a trope that still persists on some level even in recent games. But Fatal Frame 3 gives the trilogy's only stealth sequence to its only playable male character, forcing the player to run and hide from ghosts for quite a while before giving Kei his own camera obscura. I don't know that there's a whole lot of meaning to be gleaned from this, like maybe something about how the series tends to center women and their experiences with all of their female protagonists, but mostly I just think it's kind of funny. When Rei starts seeing the dreams of others is when things start getting more dire. Specifically, ghosts begin to show up in Rei's home during the day while she's awake. First it's subtle, objects falling over, ghostly legs under a curtain, but after Kei's first sequence, a ghost accosts her in the attic, and from here on, things get a lot more overt. The player never actually has to fight hostile ghosts in Rei's home, but their appearance nevertheless makes it clear that this once safe place is no longer free from these nightmares. The three continue to explore the manner of sleep and seek answers in their waking hours. Kei continues pursuing Mio, but between blocked doors and fearsome ghosts from All God's village hounding him, he finds himself at an impasse and shifts his focus from simply finding Mio to removing the curse that plagues her. Miku becomes increasingly sure that her brother Mafuyu is calling to her from further into the manor, and Rei begins to finally piece together what happened and why the manor plagues them. As with the previous two games, Fatal Frame 3's story is largely contained in its backstory. Through various items, ghosts, and other clues throughout the game, we are meant to piece together the events that transpired here a long time ago. So, time to get into that. I will say, as just kind of a quick disclaimer, this kind of almost Dark Souls-y backstory deciphering is really not my forte, and since this game isn't as popular as the other two, there's not as much in terms of resources out there for me to use to check my work and make sure that I'm right and interpreting all of this correctly. But I do apologize if there are some mistakes in the details of this, but I'm fairly confident in my understanding of it, and particularly confident in how this backstory contributes to the overall meaning, which is ultimately, what I'm trying to get at here. Of course, since the backstory is mostly communicated through notes and letters and small little hints as opposed to actually being shown, there's not a whole lot of relevant footage that I can put in here, so just enjoy some gameplay, I guess. I'll try and make it relevant where I can. The manner of sleep that these characters are encountering in their dreams is based on the location Rei was exploring at the beginning of the game, the Kuze Shrine. It takes on a disconnected element in dreams, incorporating traumatic locations from the past of the person dreaming it, but it largely reflects the original location's layout. Beneath the Kuze Shrine lies, you guessed it, an entrance to the underworld. That said, it seems far less sinister than the Hellgates from previous games. This is simply a place that connects the land of the living to the land of the dead. But it was found that mourning those who were lost tended to corrupt that connection, and the more people nearby suffered from grief, the more spirits of the dead could leak out into people's dreams. So, the Kuze Shrine had a ritual in which a maiden would voluntarily take on everyone else's pain and grief in the form of tattoos, with ink formed of the blood of both the living and the dead that they grieved. Once the tattoos have been applied over most of the priestess's body, she would engrave her own pain and grief into a mirror and shatter it, symbolically severing her ties to this world. This was an important step, as the priestess's own grief could cause the tattoo to spread on its own, and if it ever reached her eyes, they would become like mirrors that reflected all that pain back out into the world. So once she had adequately separated herself from her own earthly pains and attachments, she would be brought down to the Chamber of Thorns, a room that led to the rift, and 4 young handmaidens would sing a pacifying lullaby while they drove stakes through the priestess's hands and feet, nailing her in place so she could not wander in her sleep. It is here that the priestess would rest forever, her dreams containing all the pain that she took from others. This did not always work, of course, and there was a backup plan. If the priestess was found unworthy, incapable of holding in all that pain, she would be skinned, her body sent over the rift, and her tattooed skin hung in a deep part of the shrine. But what eventually happened was far beyond what that contingency could account for. The Kuze Shrine was not only matriarchal, but populated entirely only by women. Men were brought in on occasion, seemingly for the express purpose of providing more heirs, and were only allowed to stay as long as there was snow on the ground in the winter months. This seems to be why the head of the shrine, Yashu Kuze, allowed a folklorist named Akito to enter and become close to her daughter, Kyoka Kuze. The two fell in love, and when Akito had to leave, he gave Kyoka a set of earrings matching his own, both made of echo stone, the same material that stores voices in stones for us to listen to in the stone radios across the game, so they could still be connected and hear each other's voices. He promised to return, but for unspecified reasons, Yashu did not want this to happen, and had Akito killed after he left. Unaware of her lover's demise, Kyoka pined for him and grieved his absence forever after. What's worse, the child she bore from him turned out to be male. Unable to bear losing her only remaining connection to Akito, Kyoka named the baby Kaname, and had him smuggled out to a nearby village along with the Echo Stone earrings, in hope that Akito might come to the village and recognize his son. Of course, this did not happen, and Kaname grew up in the village ignorant of his true parentage. As he grew, Kaname developed a connection to a girl named Reika. The two fell in love, and when Kaname left the village to study in the city, he left her one of his Echo Stone earrings and promised to come back and see Reika again. But in his absence, some kind of tragedy struck the village, of which Reika was the only survivor. Taken in by the Kuze family, Reika learned of the tattooed maiden and the purpose of her ritual. Heartbroken at the loss of everyone she knew and altruistically driven to help ease the pain of anyone else who had suffered such loss, she volunteered herself to be the next tattooed maiden. But her connection to Kaname and regret over never seeing him again snuck into her dreams once the ritual had been carried out, and Kaname began having dreams of a manor and a tattooed woman. Though he did not recognize these elements, they made him nostalgic and worried about home. When he eventually heard Reika's voice through the earring, he returned in haste. Once he got to the Kuze Shrine, a young handmaiden named Amane Kuze recognized his earring as the same that her mother had once had. She knew Kaname was her half-brother, the son of the man her mother still mourned. Feeling a connection to her half-brother and having grown close to Reika over the course of her time as a handmaiden, Amane decided to help Kaname sneak in and see Reika one last time, hoping to ease Reika's emotional distress by allowing her a final opportunity to see the one she loved. Reika had already been impaled and left to sleep in the Kuze Shrine by this point, so Amane brought Kaname in to wake her and say goodbye. This, however, was strictly forbidden, even more so than Kaname's mere existence in the shrine to begin with, and Yashu, Kaname's grandmother, of course, though she could not have known, found out about it. She caught up with Kaname just as he woke Reika and killed him, right in front of Reika. His body fell next to her, his sightless eyes staring into her from mere inches away, and the trauma and grief of seeing him murdered overtook her, spreading her tattoos to her eyes and turning them into mirrors that reflected all the pain and grief she had taken in, radiating it throughout the shrine. Unlike the mass death events of the previous games in this series, however, the unleashing happened slowly, allowing time for the inhabitants of the Kuze Shrine to try and contain it, mostly by heaping more and more atrocities upon it. Amane was nailed into the Chamber of Thorns as punishment for sneaking Kaname in, and carpenters were brought in to create a new shrine to contain the rift. The Rift Shrine, however, failed to keep the rift from spreading, or to keep Reika's shade from wandering the manor, and so the manor was expanded, built on bit by bit, becoming an idiosyncratic cobweb of a building, but it was still not enough. Kuze tradition had a contingency for this too, however. to sacrifice all of the carpenters but the most talented among them, both to ensure their silence and to strengthen the ward against the rift as sacrificial pillars. The head carpenter, Tengai Narumi, regretted this duty but fulfilled it nonetheless, killing the other carpenters and putting their bodies into the walls of the manor as tradition dictated. But even still, it was not enough. Racked by guilt over the murder of his fellow builders and determined to fulfill his duty, he took his own life as the cornerstone of the Shrine of Sleep. But even it was not enough, and his own shade now wanders the manor searching for more sacrificial pillars. In the end, nothing was enough to contain the slow spread of the rift, and the manor was eventually abandoned entirely. And even farther into the future, it started spreading throughout Japan, infecting those grieving traumatic losses with the tattooed curse from which our protagonists now suffer. Rei and Miku finally talk honestly about what's going on, and Miku tells Rei all about Mafuyu and her guilt and grief over leaving him in Himuro Mansion. Rei continues seeing Miku and Kei's journeys into the Manor of Sleep, and Miku successfully pursues Mafuyu deeper into the manor. It's said that those who follow their departed loved ones all the way into the manor never wake up, and eventually leave nothing but a black stain like Yoshino did. But Miku is confronted with this opportunity to leave Mafuyu be or continue following him into the depths of the manor. The player can actually make a choice here, but frankly, if Miku leaves, she's just caught by Reika and the game moves on without any changes, so I'm going to treat the other option as canon, because honestly, I think it's one of the most tragic scenes in the entire trilogy. Miku is simply unable to let go of Mafuyu enough to turn back. As she pursues him, Rei separates, no longer inhabiting her as she has been throughout these dreams, and pleads with her to stay.
You're a stronger person than I am. Always
Don't comfort my brother.
I feel the need around
I
you
just
has made me
want to
stronger.
see him one more time.
Please, Nico, though. I wanted to be with you. Nico, don't leave me behind. Don't go.
Just once more. If only. Just once more.
But it's no use. Miku can't hear her, and when Rei wakes up, Miku still sleeps, surrounded by dark shades. It's a very tragic moment in general, and even more so if you pick up on the kinda gay subtext going on with these two characters.
Having trouble sleeping? Do you need to sleep in here with me?
It's at this point that Kei actually shows up at Rei's home and finally learns of Yu's death. He and Rei compare notes, and Kei comes up with a plan. He posits that Reika must have come loose from the nails, and that's why she's able to wander as she does. If he can find the stakes used in the ritual and nail her body back down in the Chamber of Thorns, he thinks he can end the curse. So that night, he wanders the Manor of Sleep to collect the 4 stakes and descends down to the Chamber of Thorns, only to find it covered in sleeping shrine maidens, nailed to the floor, the walls, all over, and Reika, nailed to the floor just as she always was. He was wrong. The ritual was complete, and still is, and it cannot simply be redone to stop this. As he stands in horror, Reika's nails come up from her hands and feet, and she rises to capture him. And this is actually the point where the game's endings differ. On the first playthrough, Kei leaves nothing but a black stain on Rei's couch after this. But on a second playthrough, the player can find one of Kaname's earrings, and since Reika recognizes it, she spares Kei, leaving him in a deep sleep rather than outright killing him. Honestly, it's relatively inconsequential as far as Fatal Frame ending variations go, but we'll still talk about it a bit when we dig into all the themes and stuff. Either way, Rei is left on her own to go to the Chamber of Thorns and finish this. Part of this process involves finding the shattered pieces of Reika's mirror and putting it back together, because symbolism. The approach to the rift differs slightly each time the player goes there. It's short and simple for Kei, slightly broken for Miku, and much longer and more threatening for Rei. The depths of the Manor of Sleep are increasingly dreamlike, based less on a single reality than a shifting construct mashing together Reika's memories with the dreamer's grief. When Rei finally gets to the Chamber of Thorns, she sees a vision, learning of Kaname's murder and seeing that Reika has simply been laying there, eyes open, staring at her dead love. No wonder the rift and Reika's influence just kept spreading.
That moment was always in my eyes, etched over and over, again, again. That moment was always in my eyes.
Rei battles Reika with the camera obscura, and after defeating her shade, she ends Reika's torment by simply closing her eyes. She takes Reika and Kaname's bodies deeper, to the shoreline that separates this world from the next, and sends them afloat together. Reika's tattoo curse finally lifted, the souls of those trapped in this dream world congregate and take their own journey to the afterlife, including you. Rei pursues, desperate to be with him again, but Yu insists that she live on, and absorbs her tattoos, her pain into himself, taking her grief and sorrow into the afterlife with him. Rei wakes, once again in the real world, sobbing. Later, we see Rei and Miku overlooking the ocean and affirming their will to continue on despite their grief. And in that second playthrough I mentioned earlier, the credits include pictures of Kei waking up and introducing Mio to Rei and Miku, all to a really emotional Japanese song over the credits called Koe by Tsukiko Amano. I can't play it here for copyright reasons, but look it up, you will not regret it. So that's Fatal Frame 3, and for my money, I think that it's the most thematically coherent and focused of the trilogy, which is convenient for me because it means that a lot of my analysis work is pretty much already done for me, but there's still plenty to dig into about the game's themes, how it communicates them, and how it involves the player in that process. I've already explained what makes Fatal Frame's core gameplay concepts so just remarkably brilliant in my video on the first game, and joked about how I'd already done that in my video on the second, so I won't waste your time here, just short version in case you don't want to watch those. Fatal Frame's gameplay presents itself in the third-person perspective, but requires the player to come down into a first-person perspective to fight its terrifying ghosts head-on. This is not only an inspired gameplay mechanic for a horror game, as it requires us to directly face the thing we're scared of, but it also speaks to the series' themes of folklore and overcoming ancient evils not through strength or power, but knowledge, by shining a light on hidden truths and thus rendering them powerless. Fatal Frame isn't just my favorite horror trilogy because I think the games are good, but also because I think its base gameplay format is singularly brilliant as a way to interact with a horror story. Also, fixed camera angles are amazing for horror games, fight me. Fatal Frame 3 does make a number of small additions and alterations to the core gameplay of the series, but this basic meaning remains strong, and just like Fatal Frame 2 made a few little alterations that subtly shift the metaphorical meaning of the mechanics, the Tormented has done the same. Specifically, some minor but noticeable gameplay features are missing or altered in ways that make veteran players kind of uncomfortable in their absence. Most notably, when a ghost showed up in the previous games and the player pressed the button to take out the camera, the viewfinder would automatically snap to the position of the ghost so the player could take the picture as quickly as possible. But that's no longer the case here. Instead, this feature is unlockable, only becoming available after a certain point in the game. Similarly, a recurring feature of the series is the camera's filament, which glows blue when the protagonist is facing a non-hostile ghost, and red to indicate the presence of a hostile one. This still happens in Fatal Frame 3, but oftentimes the red filament doesn't actually indicate a hostile ghost. Sometimes the player can take a picture of a ghost with the filament glowing red, and instead of a battle ensuing, the ghost just disappears. All these features contribute to a sense of unease in Fatal Frame veterans. Players who are already familiar with the series are, theoretically, fairly comfortable in its basic gameplay conventions, but these changes, while small, challenge that complacency and turn it into unease. What was familiar and comfortable instead becomes unsettling and uncertain. You might be able to see where this is going, and we're going to be getting to that soon because it's time for what we really came here for. Let's dig into exactly what Fatal Frame means and all the ways it communicates that meaning. I've said that Fatal Frame 3 is my personal favorite in the series, and there are a number of reasons for that, but this is one of the main ones. it takes a much clearer stance on the rituals in its backstory, and as a result is able to make much stronger statements. It helps that the ritual in this game is actually less horrific than the other two. It's still very messed up, but as far as I can tell, it seems to be voluntary, and that isn't nothing. Rather than grooming a girl from childhood for their eventual, horribly painful murder, Reika volunteered for the role out of a sense of empathy and altruism. And grief, but still, it was something she chose to do because she wanted to help people, rather than something she was forced to do because some elder didn't have the guts to put an end to an inhumane tradition. What's more, in the previous two games, something went wrong with the rituals because the victims dared to, not want to be brutally sacrificed against their wills. Their resistance to being gruesomely murdered is what made the rituals fail and caused apocalyptic events. But in Fatal Frame 3, it is not Reika's failure that leads to this tragedy. It's the Kuze family's adherence to brutal tradition at Reika's expense. Reika does write that she wished she could see Kaname again, but it was not a roadblock to her sacrifice the way that kind of connection was in the previous two games. She knew why she did what she did and did it willingly. To quote her diary,
I endure the piercing of the soul so people can wash away their feelings. The pain of the holly engraved on me shows me many dreams, many kinds of pain, and love. I take on the pain of being left alone, the pain of living. But these pains I bear, they do not fade, but are engraved somewhere hidden and remain. Of the various pains, the more vivid ones ache most intensely. Nobody will take my holly, it is mine alone. I engrave my feelings, my holly, in these mirrors and break them here, because they are my feelings alone. But if it were in my power, I would see him one more time.
Reika did what she did of her own free will, for kind and altruistic reasons, and what regrets she had, she willingly put to the side for the sake of accomplishing her goal. She was not the problem here. Nor were Kaname and Amane wrong in trying to ease her pain. If anything, it's implied that seeing Kaname again would grant her more closure, allow her to take on all this pain and sorrow without regrets. No, what went wrong here was in the killing of Kaname, in observance of Kuze's shrine tradition, forcing Reika to stare into the empty eyes of her beloved for all eternity, never forgetting, never sleeping, never moving on, just staring at her own trauma. Until another with the same trauma, the same loss of a loved one, finally came by and closed her eyes. It's honestly one of the most tragically beautiful ways to overcome a vengeful ghost I've ever seen in these kinds of stories. Fatal Frame 3 deftly handles something that I think the first two games kind of stumbled into a little gracelessly, that being that Fatal Frame 3 adequately condemns the wrongs done to the antagonistic spirit. It paints her unequivocally as the victim of brutal wrongdoing, and it resolves the story not by affirming the necessity of those wrongs, but by freeing her from their consequences. And that's not just coincidence. The game knowingly subverts this concept through Kei's plan near the end of the game. Kei is approaching this under the assumption that the ritual itself was not at fault, and the way to break the curse is simply to reapply it. That whatever happened to make Reika curse people like this was simply the result of the ritual not being done correctly. That he could just waltz in and reapply the trauma and everything would be better. But that wasn't the case. This is why I honestly don't hate the default ending where he dies. For as often as horror characters die for no meaningful reason, Kei's attempt to simply continue the wrongs done to Reika is a more than compelling enough thematic reason for that attempt to end in his death. But honestly, Mio's lost enough already, and I can't imagine how traumatic it would be for her to wake up from her sleep having lost yet another family member, the uncle who took her in, so I'm glad he's still around, for her sake at least. I just really appreciate how much more clearly Fatal Frame 3 places the blame for these events on the family's traditions and rituals instead of on the victim of those traditions and rituals, and how intentionally it subverts the idea that these rituals should be perpetrated at all. Now, I admit, part of that is just because I like that better, personally. That is more appealing to me. But I also think that the added clarity on that subject makes the game's real thematic point that much stronger. We've already talked about how Fatal Frame 3 is about grief and survivor's guilt, and frankly that much is pretty obvious just from the game itself. But as with many good stories, it's not just about that. It builds the entire narrative around it, like a giant support structure holding up this one particular idea. So let's look at those supports. Most clearly, all our protagonists are dealing with or adjacent to traumatic losses. Rei lost her fiancé in a car crash while she was driving, Miku left her brother Mafuyu behind at Himuro Mansion, even if it was his own choice, and while Kei doesn't seem to have any traumatic losses at first, he is looking into the manner of sleep specifically because of Mio, who killed her own twin sister in a trance-induced ritual in the previous game. What's more, it turns out Kei and Yu both worked under folklorist Jinsei Takamine, the same person Mafuyu went in search of in the first game, meaning Kei has, at this point, lost a not insignificant amount of people as well. The curse specifically targets people experiencing grief from traumatic loss. And how does the curse take them? By prompting them to follow their departed loved ones deeper and deeper away from reality, away from life, away from everything left to them in the real world, with the promise that this way, maybe they'll at least be able to see each other again. Or, sometimes, with the promise of the punishment that they believe is their due. A recurring idea these characters throw around is that they shouldn't have survived. Sometimes, as in Rei's case, this is driven by guilt. Even if it was a freak accident and there was nothing she could have done, being at the wheel makes her feel responsible. So not only does she desperately wish to see the one she loves, she also feels that it's somehow wrong that she survived when you did not. And in other cases, like Yoshino, it's simply a feeling that her survival must have been a fluke. Everyone she loved is dead, and she somehow makes it out? It has to have been some kind of cosmic mistake. Surely she was meant to die, and her life is nothing more than a glitch, waiting to be fixed. Survivor's guilt is a real thing, of course, a condition in which someone feels they have done something wrong by surviving a traumatic event that others did not. Fatal Frame 3 is more broadly about grief, but I feel the specific focus on survivor's guilt is notable, since there are very few video games that approach this particular subject. I'm sure there are more now, with indie games exploding the way they have and exploring a lot of ideas that the medium had previously shied away from, but this was very unique at the time in particular. And it's not just the victims of the curse that reflect this theme, either. Reika's motivation for becoming the Tattooed Maiden in the first place is driven in no small part by grief for those she lost, and the desire to save others that same pain. And the carpenter Tenagai Narumi sacrificed himself for the manner of sleep in part due to the guilt of having his fellow carpenters killed. It could even be argued that Amane allowed Kaname into the Chamber of Thorns partially because she felt guilty that she could still live a normal life while Reika would sleep in pain forever, or even because she felt guilty for effectively being an only child while her mother mourned the losses of her lover and son. So many character dynamics in this story are driven by grief, guilt, and the creeping feeling that simply living your life while others you love cannot is somehow profane and unearned. Which is also why the sort of uncomfortable gameplay changes and the sequences in Rei's home are so brilliant as part of this overall story. They encapsulate, through the process of play, a core concept of this kind of grief and the guilt associated with it. A growing discomfort with what was once safe, familiar, and peaceful. When you lose something important to you, the happy memories related to it can often turn into negative memories. Happiness that is no longer attainable becomes sadness. Now, you don't need a terrifying ghost game to tell you that, we've all seen Inside Out, but the way that Fatal Frame 3 encapsulates this feeling in its systems and environments is just fantastic. We already talked about how a few minor but palpable gameplay changes make the game feel a little off for people familiar with the series, but the segments in Rei's home are really what drive this point, well, home. From the beginning, we see discomfort with Yu's room, a place Rei has barely touched since his death, bathed in blue light. Oh, right, did I mention this game is very blue? Color symbolism and all that, and very intentional in case someone brings up that stupid blue curtains thing, but I don't think I really need to explain how the color blue relates symbolically to a game about sorrow and grief. So, point is, we see how Rei has become uncomfortable in her own space. How Miku is the main caretaker because Rei is in a depressive, unproductive state, and it feels more like her space than Rei's. How she barely ever leaves, but buries herself in her work so she doesn't have to simply exist in this space filled with so many soured memories. This has become a place of discomfort for her. And over the course of the game, it simulates this experience for the player. We obviously don't have the same trauma regarding the house that Rei does. In fact, it's the opposite. Early on, it's the one place that feels safe. Between each nightmarish excursion into the Manor of Sleep, we get to simply explore a house, develop the story, speak to a friend, pet a cat. Rei's home is a place of safety, of comfort. But the game doesn't allow it to stay that way. It slowly, methodically strips that comfort away until we're left with a place that isn't any more comfortable than the manor at all, but simply a different kind of horrifying. Eventually, the place we once regarded as a safe, relaxing break from all the horror becomes nothing more than another avenue for the horror to find us. This discomfort is not only central to Fatal Frame 3's themes of grief, but it also takes the series' methods of storytelling through gameplay to an entirely new level, and in my opinion at least, this series is already one of the kings of that. Of course, this is part of the story being told, but it's not the end of it, not the ultimate point. Fatal Frame 3 is about grief, about guilt, about shame, but it's ultimately about finding freedom from those things. Living, continuing on, because that's the best way to honor what we had. Learning to value the life we've yet to live over the life we could have had, and to stop staring at the things we've lost. And what's more, it's no less terrifying a game for having such a hopeful message. And honestly, that's another thing that I really love about this game. It turns out you can tell a compelling, meaningful, and even uplifting story in a video game, even while crapping your pants in terror. That's true art right there. Thanks for watching, everyone. This one's been a long time coming, and it's good to finally get back into it. Sorry for the long absence. I've been in a bit of a rut lately as far as actually getting things done, but I'm working my way out of it. I've got a couple other videos in production right now, some even already filmed, as well as some shorter form content I'm working on for TikTok and eventually YouTube, so keep an eye out for that. I'll let you know when that happens. Thanks especially to my ridiculously patient patrons. It's frankly absurd that any of y'all have stuck with me through this, and I appreciate it immensely. So keep an eye out. I should have some other stuff coming. It's definitely not going to be a year this time. Later.